welcome to this, the fourth video in my series on the basics of the music business. This time we're going to look at the difficult and often confusing issue of music publishing. As I hope has become clear in previous lessons, music publishing is a revenue source that cannot be ignored. However, it can be contentious, and for the uninitiated it can be almost incomprehensible. It can often lead to disappointment and even legal action. So let's dig deeper and see what's what. Let's compare the market. These days everybody is focused on streaming, and as you can see, this is roughly what you would earn from Spotify, and this is roughly what you would earn from Apple Music. These are both based on master and publishing payments, but they're not strictly speaking publishing itself. So, staying in the digital domain for a moment, the above figures show the average revenues generated per stream. On average, therefore, around about $6 per thousand streams on Apple Music, around about $4 per thousand streams on Spotify. The complexity of Spotify payment calculations will be discussed in a later lesson. The figures above, all of which would be revenue paid to the uploader, which would be the record label, not the publisher, are in US dollars, but despite exchange rates, they're pretty much the same in both euro and sterling. If you do your own distribution via an aggregator, then you would be paid 100% of the stream value, less any additional percentages charged by the aggregator themselves. If we compare these figures now with radio airplay, which is purely publishing, you can see that there's quite a difference. Around about £55 for a 4-minute single on BBC Radio 1 in the UK. And on TV, that gets even better, around about £208 for a 4-minute single played on primetime television. On the face of it then, the royalty rates paid by PRS to the copyright owners for radio airplay far exceeds the streaming royalties for the same play paid to you, the uploader, or to your record label. But consider this. One stream on Spotify will generate around about 0.004 cents in revenue, whereas one play on BBC Radio 1 will generate £55. So clearly Spotify is not, according to Taylor Swift and others, making fair payments. But a stream on Spotify is to one individual. BBC Radio 1 has an average of 9 million individual listeners. If those 9 million listeners all streamed your song on Spotify, you would earn about $36,000 US. Obviously, despite what some artists claim, this is not really a fair comparison, and publishing is clearly important. So where does all this publishing money come from then? Well, the royalties that your copyright society pays to you have to come from income generated from the license fees that the societies charge to broadcasters, both radio and television, along with live performance fees from venues and other sources such as, for example, background music systems. You will find background music systems in, for example, shops and supermarkets, pubs and bars, restaurants and cafes. But there are also license fees for cinemas and theatres, and these include cinema advertising, cinema idents, and cinema film scores. There are also fees for theatre scores, both for musicals and regular stage plays, along with a whole host of other incidental sources such as DJ events, weddings and parties and the like, sports stadiums, fitness venues, and even, in some cases, churches. Broadcasters, radio and TV stations mainly, pay an annual licence fee to their local copyright society. On average, the licence fee charged will be around about 1.7% of the total revenue of the broadcaster or the venue. This goes some way towards explaining why some companies have issues with this fee. 1.7% is no big deal for a major commercial radio station, but can be quite a problem for a small venue for live music by local artists or a small cafe with a background music system. When dealing with pluggers or trying to promote yourself to radio producers, it is important to remember that commercial stations need to maintain their ratings, the number of listeners they have at any one time, because the higher the rating, the more advertising revenue they can generate. In effect, this means that they will always have a preference for playlisting known artists who are guaranteed to please their listeners and therefore maintain their ratings. And while it is generally accepted that publicly funded broadcasters such as the BBC in the UK or PBS in the States have no real ratings pressure on them, they are still in the business of making quality popular programmes that draw listeners into them. This explains why, although peak or prime time royalty rates are quite high on such stations, the rates for local and regional stations, especially in non-peak periods, can be almost non-existent. Remember also that commercial stations, both TV and radio, are not only competing for listeners to maintain their ratings, they're also competing with each other to try and steal each other's listeners and viewers. There are a number of important points here. Firstly, the figures I have quoted for radio and TV airplay are the maximums you will receive if you are getting mainstream national exposure. Most of us don't get that. The royalty rates for local and regional airplay, non-primetime airplay and even national FM airplay on other stations can be considerably less. For example, PRS rates for local radio, even BBC local stations, can be as low as 0.09 pence per minute. Getting any kind of airplay at all is a skilled job, certainly not for the faint-hearted, and handled usually by professionals, pluggers, more on them in later lessons. And these guys have a vast network of contacts and relationships within the broadcast industry. It would be a mistake to see this as an either-or debate. Radio exposure, for example, no matter how local, can and does drive streaming revenue, as many listeners to radio also have streaming accounts with Spotify and Apple Music, etc. For example, how often have you heard a song on your car radio and then checked it out on Spotify in the evening when you get home? Succeeding in the music business is all about understanding the often very complex relationships between media outlets and the business structures behind them. Let's take another look at our diagram. Following the money. In Lesson 2, we looked at this chart, and yes, I know it's still complicated, but we looked at it from the point of view of the artist and the artist's revenue and where the money comes from. This time, we're going to look at it from a purely publishing point of view to see where the publisher and the composer revenue comes from. Let's start with mechanical royalties. The record label pays for the costs involved in pressing, including the mechanical copyright fees, as well as the costs involved in distribution. And as we saw in Lesson 2, mechanical royalties are collected by the Copyright Society for every physical pressed copy of a copyright work. This also applies to any inclusion of the master recording in a third-party product, such as a film soundtrack or a computer game, and this is known as sync licensing. A sync license is needed by any production company who wishes to synchronize your music with moving pictures. In other words, a TV program, broadcast advertising, video, DVD, film or video game, amongst other things. Normally, this is linked to a master use license for the right to synchronize the master and use it in the project and, as such, will be subject to a fee, payable by the program maker, the production company, directly to the rights owner or his or her representative. An active publisher will have a network of contacts in the media industry, including, crucially, music supervisors. Because sync is directly related to the use of the master recording, it does not involve a copyright society directly. However, any production company making use of a master recording in their project should notify their local copyright society of the intended broadcast use via a cue sheet so that any future performing royalties can be tracked and paid. Again, you can always do this for yourself, but it's a hard world to break into on your own. There are companies out there who will help you, the Unsigned Library, for example. Performing royalties. The record label also pays for the costs involved in the promotion, plugging, of the recorded works. We all know that promotion equals sales, right? Well, promotion also equals airplay. And as we saw earlier, airplay can generate far more revenue than sales. Remember, record labels spend money, publishers earn it back again. Whether you are signed to a label or writing as an independent composer, membership of a copyright society is the only way to guarantee an income from your work and protection of your rights overall. So what does a publisher actually do? Well, a publisher publishes your work, your intellectual property. In other words, you grant to the publisher the right to act on your behalf to exploit your composer's rights. At the very least, the publisher will ensure correct collection and distribution of any royalties you may be owed, but this is passive publishing. But any decent publisher will actively try and place your work in areas where it will generate even more royalties. A publishing contract does not give, sell or lend all of your copyright to the publisher. What it does is give the publisher the right to both represent and administer your copyright and to own a percentage of those rights for the duration of the contract. But beware. Some contracts confer rights to the publisher for life, i.e. long after the contract itself has expired. At no time, unless you choose to waive that right, can anyone else be named as the composer of any work composed by you. This is your moral right. Where applicable, a publisher may also print and distribute sheet music and or MIDI file copies of your work for sale. Ever gone into a music store and brought a book of songs by your favourite artist? A publisher is there to exploit your work. At the very basic level, a publisher works with the label performing all of the functions listed below in order to secure the revenues generated by the label's own promotion, marketing and sales departments. This is what is known as passive publishing. A publisher works with the label to ensure correct payment of all royalties arising from sales and promotion. A publisher works with other labels and publishers in other territories to secure local releases. They work with other labels to secure recordings of your work by other artists. And they attempt to place your work with third-party products such as compilation albums, computer games, karaoke systems, in-store music systems, etc., etc. However, it is in the interest of both the publisher and the label, as well as you, the composer, to have a publisher who is constantly on the lookout for new opportunities. Think in terms of the Rembrandts' I'll Be There For You theme for Friends, or Bare Naked Ladies, The Big Bang Theory, both good examples of active publishing. An active publisher will be constantly on the lookout for opportunities to exploit the value of your intellectual property. Another aspect of the music publishing world is the world of library or stock music. This is music publishing that is aimed very specifically at broadcast use in other projects. Music for TV commercials, documentaries, etc. And it has a very different relationship with the composers than a commercial music publisher. This is a world where composers are commissioned by a publisher. The publisher then creates and presses CDs or database records containing that commissioned work, which is then distributed to film and TV production companies for use in their own projects. The publisher then actively promotes your work to film and television and other multimedia companies to secure usage, generating both performing and mechanical royalties, as well as synchronization fees. On the following slide is an example of one of my royalty statements, just to give you an idea of where the money really is. As you can see, in this case, our publisher, Music House International, have been very busy, and they've secured usages for us in Canada, Poland, Greece, Germany, quite a few in America, and even some in Japan. In the case of library music publishing, there is no label as such. It is solely the publisher who handles all of the promotion to the production companies who would use such music. The publisher pays for the pressing and distribution of CDs to media production companies. Occasionally, though not always, they pay a nominal fee to the composer to cover the recording costs. The production company pays nothing, although it is common for them to pay a sync fee for the right to use the master and the IP in their production. More on this in later lessons. And they must ensure that any work used is submitted to the relevant Copyright Society via the cue sheet. The broadcaster, well, they pay the annual license fee to the Copyright Society. Due to the ongoing nature of library music publishing, a library contract can be very different from a commercial music publishing agreement and is usually for life. Now, this may sound at first a little scary, but if we take the example I showed you of the work that Charlie and I have done for Music House, we can see that although the original recordings were made in the mid-1980s, the tracks are still generating an income 40 years later. Third-party content. Game music is a good example of third-party content use. Although custom composition is the norm for most game soundtracks, there are opportunities for licensing existing tracks. Game music, however, is still a very contentious issue, as game industry and music industry business models often clash. In this case, however, it was a simple matter to acquire music content for gameplay, as the music publishers were effectively being given the opportunity to gain additional exposure, and therefore revenue, for the music that they represented. For this particular game, there were actually 4 different versions, each with their own licensing requirements. The original version, with multiple labels and multiple publishers and multiple artists, followed by a special Trance Classics edition with a single label but multiple publishers and multiple artists. And then there were 2 artist-specific versions, one for Robbie Rivera and the other one for Julie Thompson. both of which were actually linked to albums, and therefore the game was also promoting the album itself. In all cases, the individual works publishers received a payment based on a 1/12 share, or whichever number of total tracks there were in each version, of an agreed total percentage of the gross revenue from sales. Each 1/12 share paid to the publisher was subsequently distributed to the composers based on the share of the original publishing agreement. Self-publishing and Creative Commons. Can you publish yourself? Of course you can. There is no law that says that released music has to have a publisher or even has to be registered with a copyright society. However, entering the market without registering your work is risky. You can do all of your own administration. Copyright societies will accept work with only the composer nominated as the rights holder, and they will pay 100% of all incoming royalties to that person. Within your own territory, this is actually quite straightforward. It only gets complicated when you start making a name for yourself abroad. Remember, copyright societies are passive organisations. In other words, copyright societies do not actively go out and look for your royalties. They would need to employ thousands of people to do this. They make payments based on the information they receive in the form of declared playlists or cue sheets. If that information is incorrect, it is up to you to let them know. This means that you, yourself, must be aware of what's happening with your work. Creative Commons is effectively self-publishing, but although some CC licenses allow for commercial use of works, they do not allow for any kind of payment. By issuing a work under a CC commercial license, you may be waiving your right to collect any revenue generated by any third-party use. You are simply allowing your work to be used for commercial purposes. Unlike a copyright society, there is no system in place for royalty payments. Some CC commercial use licenses also include the right to edit, adapt or remix. If you do not want to allow this, you need to be very sure you have selected the right type of license before releasing your work this way. Sharing your work in the public domain is an admirable thing to do and can be very effective in promoting yourself. But please read all of the different license options and conditions carefully before you proceed and select the appropriate license to suit your requirements. And heads up, most copyright societies will not accept a work for registration if it is already in the public domain, even under a CC license. Well, that concludes our look at the basics of music publishing, and as always, here are some useful links. So, clearly it is not necessary to have a music publisher, but a good one will be worth their percentage. It's important to understand what is being done on your behalf and the relationship this all has with the copyright societies that we discussed in the previous lesson. Knowledge is power. In the next video we will dive into royalties and revenue, so be sure to like and subscribe, and if you can, please also support us on patreon.com/Lavender Vale. Thank you for listening.